Daniel Rojas was just 23 years old when the war reached the small, fog-covered border village where he had been stationed. He had grown up in a quiet town, far from any conflict, and never imagined that his life would be filled with the sound of gunfire and the weight of responsibility for human lives. Yet here he was, a medic in an army far larger than himself, trained to patch wounds, stop bleeding, and sometimes hold the hands of those who might not survive. Every day was a test of courage and patience. But Daniel had always believed that saving lives was worth every risk, even if it meant facing dangers that made other soldiers hesitate. The night of the attack began like any other, with a restless wind whispering through the trees and the distant sound of artillery booming across the horizon. Daniel's unit had been assigned to hold a narrow pass, a place that was critical for both sides. Orders came quickly, voices shouted in the dark, and the ground shook beneath him as explosions echoed through the valley. Chaos reigned, and soldiers scrambled to defend their positions, some falling while others ran blindly into the smoke and shadows. Daniel stayed close to his medikit, moving from one injured soldier to another, trying to bring calm amid the panic. Then the explosion happened. A shell landed too close, and Daniel was thrown to the ground. His ears rang, dust filled his lungs, and when he scrambled to his feet, he realized he was alone. The unit had scattered, and the once familiar forest now felt like a maze of shadows and danger. Heart pounding, he called out for anyone nearby, but only silence answered him. That's when he saw her. She lay behind a fallen tree, barely moving, her armor dented and scorched, her breathing shallow. At first, Daniel thought she might be another soldier, perhaps a young recruit lost in the chaos. But then he noticed the insignia on her chestplate, a symbol he had only seen in news reports and old history books. She was the enemy queen herself, a woman whose very name carried fear and respect across the borders. To see her injured and alone was like seeing a legend fall from the pages of a story into the harsh reality of war. Daniel's training kicked in immediately, though a part of him froze at the sight. He knelt beside her, checking her pulse, feeling the heat of her fevered skin. Her breathing was uneven, and a jagged cut ran across her arm. He tore a strip of cloth from his own uniform to make a bandage, trying to stop the bleeding as gently as possible. She opened her eyes briefly, startled and mistrustful, her gaze sharp and commanding even in pain. For a moment, Daniel felt the weight of the world on his shoulders. Here was a woman who ruled a nation, and yet in this moment, she was human, vulnerable, and entirely dependent on him. He remembered every lesson from his training. Keep calm, work quickly, and never let fear dictate your actions. And so he worked, cleaning her wounds, stabilizing her, whispering words of reassurance he wasn't sure she could understand or trust. Around them, the sounds of battle continued. Insects buzzed through the smoke, and distant shouts reminded Daniel that danger was still everywhere. Every step he took to help her was measured, careful, because he knew that one wrong move could cost both their lives. But despite the fear, there was also a strange clarity. He could see her humanity beneath the armor and the title she carried. She was not a symbol of the enemy in that moment. She was a person who needed him, and for Daniel, there was no choice. Leaving her there was not an option. Doing nothing was never in his nature. That as he worked, he noticed small details that humanized her further. The faint scent of lavender from her cloak, the delicate hands that had once signed orders commanding armies, now trembling slightly in pain. She tried to speak, perhaps to warn him, perhaps to demand that he leave, but her words were weak. Daniel understood a few phrases, enough to sense her fear and confusion. In her eyes, he saw the disbelief that someone from the enemy side would risk their life to help her. It struck him that the world had taught them to see each other as enemies, as targets, as symbols, but here, in the dim light of a war-torn forest, they were just two human beings clinging to life. The minutes stretched into hours as Daniel worked quietly, listening to the distant rumble of conflict, trying to imagine a path to safety. He knew that staying in one place was dangerous. Sooner or later, patrols from either side could discover them. His mind raced, considering every possible route, every small chance of survival. Yet even amid this calculation, he could not ignore the small connection forming between them, a bond forged not through words or allegiance but through the simplest act of survival. He helped her sit upright, adjusted her makeshift bandage, and offered water from his canteen. She accepted it with hesitation, as if testing whether his kindness was real, and in that simple gesture, a fragile trust began to form. Daniel understood that what he was doing could change everything. If his own commanders discovered that he had spared the life of the enemy queen, he might face punishment, suspicion, or worse. Yet he could not allow fear to dictate his choices. Every instinct screamed to act, to move forward, to ensure she survived. And so, with quiet determination, he prepared himself for the journey ahead, knowing that each step would be a test of courage, endurance, and humanity. The battle may have been raging around them, but in that moment, Daniel realized that saving her life was the only battle that truly mattered. Daniel knew that staying in the forest was not an option. The enemy patrols could appear at any moment, and even his own army might mistake him for a traitor. He looked at the queen, her eyes half closed in pain, and made a decision that would change both their lives. he would carry her or at least guide her through the rugged mountains and forests to reach a neutral zone where medical help could be found. The thought of 30 miles seemed impossible, but there was no other choice. He wrapped her arm around his shoulder, supporting her weight, and took a careful step forward, every movement deliberate to avoid aggravating her injuries. Each step was heavy, not just because of the physical strain, but because Daniel understood the immense responsibility he carried. The first few miles were the hardest. The terrain was unforgiving, covered in fallen branches, loose stones, and patches of mud. The cold wind bit at his skin, and every so often he had to pause to catch his breath. The Queen tried to speak, but her voice was weak, almost a whisper. Daniel responded gently, not because she was royalty, but because she was human and frightened. He gave her small sips of water, whispered encouragements, and adjusted her bandages whenever he could. The quiet moments between their struggles were filled with an odd sense of understanding. Neither spoke much, but there was a silent acknowledgement that they were in this together as they moved. The sounds of war were never far away. Gunfire echoed in the distance, and the ground occasionally trembled under the impact of distant explosions. Daniel kept his senses sharp, listening for approaching soldiers or signs of danger. He knew that being discovered could mean death for both of them. Sometimes he would stop and crouch behind trees, peering through the darkness to ensure they were not being followed. The Queen remained as still as she could, trusting him to guide them. Though she was constantly aware of how vulnerable she was, her trust grew slowly, shaped by Daniel's careful actions and unwavering determination. That journey tested Daniel in every way. His muscles ached from carrying her weight and navigating steep hills, while his feet were blistered and sore. Hunger gnawed at him, and his water supply was limited. Yet, each time he considered giving up, he reminded himself that he could not fail. This was not just a soldier saving an enemy. This was a human saving another human life. The Queen, too, struggled. Every step caused her pain, and she could not help but feel the shame of being a leader who had to rely on an enemy for survival. Yet she could not deny the quiet bravery of the man who had refused to leave her behind. Along the path, small moments of humanity surfaced. Daniel found berries along the trail and offered them to the Queen, who accepted them hesitantly. He used the water from a nearby stream to clean her wounds as best as he could, knowing that infection was a real threat in such conditions. They shared quiet moments where words were unnecessary, her soft sighs of relief when a bandage was applied, his careful steps to keep her balanced, the simple comfort of knowing someone was watching over you. These small acts of care created a fragile bond that neither of them had expected, formed not from allegiance or duty, but from the basic need to survive. As night fell, the forest became more dangerous. Shadows twisted among the trees, and unfamiliar noises made Daniel's heart race. He kept close to the Queen, guiding her through narrow paths and low-hanging branches. Every so often they would pause, crouching behind rocks or under thick foliage, waiting for the sounds of distant patrols to fade. The cold seeped into their bones, and Daniel shared what little warmth he could, wrapping his coat around her shoulders. In those quiet, tense moments, the Queen's fear was palpable, but so was her growing sense of respect for the man who refused to abandon her. The physical challenges were relentless. Steep climbs and sudden drops forced Daniel to plan each movement carefully. He used every ounce of strength to lift her over obstacles, sometimes dragging her when her injuries made walking impossible. He kept talking to her, even if she could barely respond, narrating small things about the landscape or telling her to focus on the next step. His voice became a constant reassurance, a reminder that she was not alone. The Queen's initial skepticism gradually faded, replaced by a cautious trust. She began to understand that the man at her side was not driven by politics. Fear or allegiance was driven by compassion. Through the long journey, Daniel's mind often drifted to the impossible odds of survival. 30 miles through enemy territory, with a wounded Queen and no backup, seemed like a death sentence. Yet, with each step, he pushed forward. The thought of leaving her behind was unthinkable. He imagined the consequences of failure, the lives that could be affected if she did not survive, and it strengthened his resolve. Every step became a test of endurance and willpower, as much mental as physical. Despite exhaustion, there were fleeting moments of connection and even humor. Daniel would tease her lightly to lift her spirits, and she would manage a faint smile, even in pain. They spoke of small, ordinary things to distract from the fear, the weather, the strange shapes of trees, or the simple beauty of a quiet stream. These conversations, brief and fragile, created a human connection that transcended the violence surrounding them. In a world defined by conflict and suspicion, they found a rare moment of shared humanity. The journey also revealed the Queen's resilience. Even in weakness, she demonstrated patience and courage. She followed Daniel's lead, trusted his judgment, and endured the pain without complaint. Her strength impressed him more than any title or insignia could. Each time she stumbled or faltered, Daniel was there, steadying her, offering encouragement, refusing to let her give up. In return, her gratitude and quiet acknowledgement reminded him why he risked everything. The act of saving another person, regardless of their position or allegiance, was the truest measure of courage. As they neared the halfway point, Both were exhausted, their bodies pushed to the limit. Daniel's arms ached, his feet were raw, and sleep was a distant memory. Yet the thought of reaching safety kept him moving. The Queen's breathing was steadier now, her confidence growing as she realized he would not abandon her. The bond between them, forged in pain, fear, and shared determination, had become unbreakable. They were no longer just soldier and enemy leader, they were two humans clinging to hope and survival. In a world gone mad by the time the first light of dawn filtered through the trees, Daniel and the Queen had covered many miles. The forest, once a place of fear and uncertainty, now seemed like a path to salvation. Every step forward was a triumph over exhaustion, over fear, and over the hatred that had been drilled into them from birth. In that moment, the journey was not just about reaching a safe haven. It was about proving that courage, compassion, and humanity could exist even in the darkest corners of war. With every mile, Daniel's resolve strengthened, and the Queen's trust deepened. They had survived the impossible together, and though neither spoke of it, both understood that the bond they shared would last far beyond the forest. Every step was a testament to their resilience, a silent promise that no matter the odds, life could still be preserved, and hope could still be found, even amidst the chaos of battle. By the time Daniel and the Queen finally reached the neutral outpost, both were exhausted beyond imagination. His clothes were torn, his body aching from carrying her through rough terrain, and his feet blistered from non-stop walking. The Queen, pale and weak, barely had the strength to stand on her own, yet her eyes held a mix of fear and relief. As they approached the outpost, Daniel signaled to the guards, explaining quickly and simply that she was gravely injured and needed immediate medical attention. The soldiers, cautious at first, were quickly convinced by the sight of her condition and the urgency in Daniel's voice. Without delay, the Queen was rushed to the makeshift hospital area, where doctors and nurses quickly took over. Daniel stayed nearby, his hands shaking slightly as he watched them work, feeling a strange mix of worry and hope. The medical team worked swiftly. They cleaned her wounds, stitched deep cuts, and treated the bruises that covered her arms and legs. A high fever had set in, and the doctors worried about infection. Daniel assisted where he could, passing supplies and offering updates on what he had observed during their journey. He explained how she had been injured and how he had kept her alive during the 30-mile trek. Every detail mattered. The staff listened intently, impressed by his endurance and commitment. Daniel watched as the Queen was carefully moved to a cot, and he realized that the danger they had survived together was now behind them, but the political and personal consequences were just beginning. Once the Queen was stable and resting, Daniel's relief was quickly replaced by uncertainty. He knew that returning to his own unit would not be easy. His superiors would want answers. Why had he been out of position? Why had he helped the enemy Queen instead of focusing on his own soldiers? And how had he managed to survive with her in enemy territory? He was prepared to face questioning, even suspicion. When he returned, the initial reactions were mixed. Some officers were shocked and angry, viewing his actions as betrayal. Others, more thoughtful, recognized the courage and humanity it took to prioritize saving a life over orders. Daniel remained calm, explaining what had happened step by step, hoping that reason would prevail over judgment. Meanwhile, the Queen began to regain her strength slowly. Her first coherent words were directed at Daniel. Despite being weak, she spoke clearly, expressing a mixture of gratitude and disbelief that an enemy soldier had risked so much to save her. It was a strange and delicate moment. She was a ruler, accustomed to command and authority, yet here she was, a patient dependent on the mercy of someone she should have considered an opponent. Daniel felt a sense of quiet pride, not for recognition or reward, but because he had upheld the principle that every human life mattered, regardless of sides in a war. International observers and mediators arrived soon after, learning about the incident from both the neutral outpost staff and Daniel himself. Reports highlighted the extraordinary nature of what had occurred. An enemy leader, gravely injured, saved by a soldier from the opposing side under extremely dangerous conditions. Diplomats and journalists were interested, understanding that this story could change the course of tensions between the two nations. The survival of the Queen became symbolic, a potential turning point in a conflict that had seemed endless. Daniel's role was scrutinized, but slowly. The recognition of his courage and moral integrity began to outweigh the suspicion of his actions. Daniel's own emotions were complicated. He was proud of what he had done, yet he knew that he had risked everything, including his own reputation, to do it. He felt the weight of the Queen's life on his shoulders during that entire journey, and even now he could not relax completely. At the same time, he felt a strange connection to her. Their bond had been forged in hardship, fear, and shared determination. Even without speaking, they understood that their experience had changed both of them, creating respect, trust, and a profound sense of human connection. For the Queen, the experience was transformative. She had faced mortality in a way that few leaders ever did, and the knowledge that someone from the enemy's side had saved her life left a deep impression. She was acutely aware that her survival depended entirely on Daniel's courage and determination. As she recovered, she began to reconsider what leadership meant, realizing that compassion and humanity could be more powerful than fear or political maneuvering. Daniel's actions had challenged the way she viewed not only soldiers of the opposing army, but also the possibilities of peace. As she grew stronger, the Queen publicly acknowledged Daniel's actions, while she did not fully reveal all the details. Immediately, she ensured that it was known he had risked his life to save hers. This public recognition was significant, not just for Daniel, but for the perception of both sides in the conflict. It highlighted that bravery and morality could exist even among enemies. Her words were carefully measured, emphasizing gratitude and the importance of human life, rather than focusing on politics or favoritism. For Daniel, hearing this from her was both humbling and validating, reinforcing the belief that he had done the right thing despite the risks. Even as the Queen recovered, Daniel remained under observation. His own army wanted to ensure that he had not compromised intelligence or assisted the enemy beyond what was necessary to save a life. He was interrogated, questioned, and analyzed, but he remained honest and consistent in his account. Slowly, officials recognized that his actions were guided purely by compassion, bravery, and medical duty. They realized that punishing him would be unjust, as he had prevented what could have been a political and humanitarian disaster. Eventually, he was cleared, though the experience left him more cautious and aware of the complex dynamics between duty, morality, and the rules of war. During this time, Daniel and the Queen shared quiet moments, far from the scrutiny of soldiers and diplomats. She thanked him privately, expressing her deep appreciation for his unwavering courage and care. They spoke briefly about the journey, the hardships, and the choices he had made. Though they could not discuss everything openly, these moments cemented a personal bond that transcended the battlefield. Daniel realized that the connection they shared was rare, built on mutual respect, trust, and the recognition of each other's humanity. The Queen's survival became a turning point beyond their personal story. News of the rescue spread slowly, at first, then more widely, emphasizing the humanity that could exist even in times of war. Daniel's actions inspired others, serving as a reminder that courage and compassion were powerful tools in a world often dominated by conflict and fear. The story of a soldier saving the enemy queen became a symbol of hope, showing that even in the darkest times, individuals could make choices that changed the course of lives and perhaps even history. Through it all, Daniel remained humble. He did not seek praise or accolades. His concern had always been for the Queen's safety, not recognition. Yet he could not ignore the fact that his actions had far-reaching consequences, influencing both political and humanitarian perspectives. The experience left him changed, more aware of the complexity of war, the fragility of life, and the extraordinary power of a single act of courage. For the Queen, it was equally transformative, shaping her leadership, outlook, and understanding of what it meant to trust, survive, and value the lives of others. By the time she was fully stabilized, Daniel knew that their paths would likely diverge. The journey had ended, but the impact of what had happened would last far longer. The Queen's gratitude and recognition, combined with international acknowledgement, created a moment where the human side of war became undeniable. Daniel had acted not as a soldier seeking glory, but as a person choosing life over politics, compassion over fear, and morality over convenience. In saving her, he had changed more than just her fate. He had created a story of courage, trust, and humanity that would resonate long after the battlefields were silent. Months had passed since the Queen's recovery, and the war that had once seemed endless had begun to cool at the edges. Tension still existed between the two nations, but the survival of the Queen, and the story of the soldier who had saved her, had opened doors that were previously unimaginable. Daniel had returned to his duties, now regarded as a hero by some, and viewed with suspicion by others. He continued to work quietly, performing his medical responsibilities with the same dedication as before, but there was always a quiet tension in the back of his mind and awareness that his actions had drawn attention, and that the world might soon call on him in ways he could not predict. It was during a neutral humanitarian conference that Daniel first saw her again. He had been invited as a medical representative, largely because of his experience in the field, but he did not know that the Queen herself would be attending. As the delegates assembled in the large conference hall, he felt a mix of curiosity and apprehension. Discussions of treaties, aid programs, and ceasefire arrangements filled the room, but his attention kept drifting toward the entrance. When she arrived, moving slowly but with unmistakable dignity, the air seemed to shift. Even amid the bustle of diplomats and officials, her presence was magnetic. People noticed her, paused, and deferred to her, yet her gaze was searching. And when it met Daniel's, recognition flashed instantly. The moment was almost surreal. Here was the woman he had carried through forests and mountains, the woman whose life had rested entirely on his courage and determination. She approached him calmly, yet there was a warmth in her eyes that he could not forget. Despite the formal setting, she spoke first, thanking him publicly for what he had done. Her voice was steady, deliberate, and yet carried a depth of emotion that made the audience quiet. She described without embellishment, the danger she had faced and the bravery of the man who had ensured her survival. In that instant, Daniel felt the weight of the months behind them, the exhaustion, the fear, the uncertainty all crystallize into a single moment of recognition and respect. After the formal acknowledgments, they had a chance to speak privately. She asked about the journey, about how he had endured the pain and fear, and how he had made the choices that ultimately saved her life. Daniel explained quietly, without dramatizing, describing each mile, each step, each decision, and how he had never considered leaving her behind. She listened intently, absorbing the story from the perspective of the man who had lived it, and not just from the narrative of survival that had reached her kingdom. In those quiet moments, a profound understanding formed. They were no longer just queen and soldier. They were witnesses to the same trials, survivors of the same danger, and participants in a story that neither would ever forget. The queen's demeanor was remarkable. Even though she had been weakened by her injuries, there was a strength in the way she spoke, a resilience that had been sharpened by the experience. She acknowledged Daniel's actions not as a simple act of duty, but as a choice that required moral courage and personal sacrifice. She emphasized how unusual it was for a soldier to act against the expectations of war to save a life that was politically his enemy. Her words carried weight not only because she was a queen, but because they were deeply sincere, grounded in gratitude that went beyond protocol or politics. Daniel felt a sense of humility, understanding that his actions had left an impression far larger than he had anticipated. Their conversations extended beyond mere gratitude. The queen began to seek his insight on matters of medical aid, safety protocols, and the treatment of civilians in conflict zones. She recognized that his experience, endurance, and compassion were invaluable not only for her personal survival but also for broader humanitarian efforts. Daniel shared what he had learned in the field, emphasizing practical knowledge, foresight, and preparation. In doing so, he realized that their connection could be used for something meaningful, helping others, building bridges, and reducing the suffering caused by conflict. In a way, the bond formed in the forest now had the potential to influence peace efforts on a larger scale. As the conference progressed, their collaboration became evident to others. Delegates noticed the quiet coordination between the two, the subtle ways in which Daniel's insights complemented the queen's plans. She began to introduce him to key figures, highlighting his expertise and bravery, framing him as a trusted advisor and bridge between former enemies. The trust she placed in him was extraordinary, and Daniel could feel a mixture of pride and responsibility. He was no longer just a soldier who had saved a life. He was now a participant in shaping outcomes, offering guidance that could have real consequences for stability and humanitarian efforts. Throughout this process, Daniel observed the queen closely. Her survival had transformed her, adding layers of empathy, patience, and insight to her leadership. She spoke to him of her fears during the journey, of her reflections on mortality, and how experiencing vulnerability firsthand had altered her perception of power. Daniel listened, absorbing her perspective while recognizing how rare it was for a leader to engage with someone outside the political sphere in such an honest, personal manner. Their exchanges were built on mutual respect, grounded in shared experience, and free of the pretense that often defined interactions between leaders and subordinates, even in public. Their dynamic was remarkable. While others watched formalities and ceremonies, Daniel and the queen often exchanged subtle glances, small gestures, and quiet confirmations that only they understood. It was clear to observers that something extraordinary had occurred between them. Though it was impossible to define with simple terms, their relationship defied expectations. It was not loyalty born of orders, nor was it political calculation. It was a deep, mutual acknowledgement of bravery, humanity, and trust, forged in a crucible of danger that neither could forget. As the days of the conference passed, their collaboration strengthened. The queen began to advocate for policies inspired by Daniel's experience, improved medical aid for soldiers and civilians, protocols for emergency evacuation, and programs to support trauma recovery. Daniel provided practical guidance, drawing from his first-hand knowledge, and together they worked to ensure that the lessons learned from one perilous journey could benefit many more. Through this work, their relationship became a symbol of what could be achieved when courage and compassion transcended borders, demonstrating that trust in humanity could survive even in the shadow of conflict. By the end of the conference, it was evident that their reunion was more than a personal reconnection. The queen had publicly acknowledged Daniel's role, and their collaboration was influencing decisions at the highest levels. Daniel felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing that the journey they had survived together was now shaping a broader story of peace, care, and cooperation. He understood that the bond they shared would endure, not because of titles or recognition, but because it was rooted in an unshakable foundation of shared hardship, trust, and respect. Even after the formal events concluded, the queen made it clear that she wanted Daniel involved in her future humanitarian missions. She valued his judgment, his moral clarity, and his ability to act decisively under pressure. Daniel accepted, understanding that their connection now carried purpose beyond personal gratitude. He would walk beside her again, not through forests of danger, but through the complicated terrain of diplomacy, aid, and rebuilding lives. Their partnership had grown from survival to collaboration, transforming an extraordinary act of courage into a lasting alliance that would touch the lives of many. Through it all, Daniel felt a quiet, profound change within himself. The fear and uncertainty of their original journey had given way to purpose and direction. He recognized that their shared experience had created an unbreakable bond, one that neither time nor circumstance could diminish. For the Queen, the reunion reaffirmed her understanding of trust in humanity, showing her that, even in the midst of political tension, there were individuals whose actions could transcend fear and conflict. Together, they had transformed a moment of peril into an enduring story of respect, courage, and hope that would continue to influence their lives and the lives of those around them. After the conference, Daniel's life took on a new rhythm, one that was both familiar and profoundly changed. He returned to his work with renewed purpose, but now he carried with him the knowledge that his actions had made a lasting difference, only in saving the Queen's life but in influencing the paths of nations. The Queen, fully recovered and more determined than ever, continued her reign with a perspective shaped by vulnerability, survival, and trust. Their bond, forged in the depths of danger, had transformed into something enduring, a quiet yet powerful connection that neither distance nor duty could diminish. Even after the war officially ended, the Queen insisted on keeping Daniel involved in her initiatives. She trusted him implicitly, recognizing that his judgment, courage, and compassion were rare qualities. They traveled together on humanitarian missions, visiting villages affected by conflict, distributing medical supplies, and ensuring that aid reached those who needed it most. Wherever they went, Daniel's presence provided a sense of security and practical expertise. While the Queen's leadership inspired hope and coordination, people around them began to notice the unusual yet effective partnership. A former enemy, a soldier and a queen working side by side, united by shared experience and a commitment to human life. Their travels were not without challenges. Roads were still dangerous in some regions, and tensions lingered in places where the war had left scars. Daniel often found himself assessing situations with the same caution and decisiveness that had saved the Queen in the forest. He guided teams through rough terrain, advised on medical protocols, and sometimes even stepped in to diffuse misunderstandings between local communities. Through it all, the Queen relied on his insight, demonstrating a deep respect that went beyond mere gratitude. She sought his advice openly, knowing that he had a perspective shaped by action, not politics, and that he valued humanity above allegiance. As the months passed, the bond between them grew stronger. It was not a relationship defined by politics, titles, or obligation, but by shared experience and trust. The Queen often visited Daniel when he was stationed in remote areas, seeking his counsel or simply spending time with someone who had proven that courage and compassion could exist even in the darkest times. Daniel, in turn, admired her resilience, and the way she had transformed her near-death experience into action that helped countless others. Their connection became a quiet legend among those who worked with them, a story whispered in camps and offices alike, of a soldier who had saved the Queen, and a queen who had never forgotten the man who had risked everything to preserve life. Their work also had broader implications. The Queen began implementing programs inspired by Daniel's experience, creating medical training initiatives for both her own people and former adversaries. She emphasized the importance of preparation, compassion, and the ability to act decisively in emergencies. Daniel was instrumental in these efforts, training teams, advising on logistics, and ensuring that the programs were both practical and effective. Together, they transformed a story of survival into a movement of care and resilience, showing that acts of humanity could ripple far beyond the individuals involved. Despite their busy schedules and responsibilities, the Queen and Daniel maintained a personal connection that was unique and profound. They shared quiet conversations during long journeys, reflecting on their experiences, the lessons learned, and the people they had helped. Daniel would recount moments from their journey, reminding the Queen of small acts that had made survival possible, while she would reflect on how those acts had changed her understanding of leadership, trust, and humanity. These exchanges, though often private, reinforced the bond that had begun in a forest of danger and hardship, proving that friendship and loyalty could transcend titles and boundaries. Over time, Daniel noticed that the Queen's presence was no longer only symbolic in his life. It was guiding him, shaping his decisions, and influencing his approach to his own duties. Her recognition of his skill, courage, and compassion gave him confidence, reinforcing the belief that one person's actions could make a difference in the lives of many. The Queen, in turn, relied on his honesty and perspective to make difficult choices, understanding that his experience as a soldier and medic brought insights that others could not provide. Their partnership became a model of cooperation and mutual respect, showing that even the most unlikely alliances could yield extraordinary outcomes. The public, too, began to recognize their unique bond. Stories spread of Daniel accompanying the Queen on missions, advising her on medical and humanitarian matters, and contributing to the rebuilding of communities affected by war. People admired the trust between them, and many were inspired to act with greater compassion and courage in their own lives. The story of the soldier and the queen became a symbol, not only of survival but of the power of human connection, bravery, and loyalty. It demonstrated that trust earned through action and courage could endure far longer than any title or political alliance. Even as years passed, the queen continued to follow Daniel's work closely. She requested his presence for critical missions, sought his advice in moments of crisis, and remained engaged in the programs they had built together. For Daniel, this was both an honor and a responsibility. He understood that their partnership was rare, built on shared experience and an unspoken understanding that transcended rank, nationality, or politics. Each time they reunited, the memories of their journey, the fear, the exhaustion, the trust reminded them both of the strength and resilience that had brought them together. Their bond also influenced the culture of leadership and service in both their spheres. The Queen's reliance on Daniel highlighted the importance of courage, moral integrity, and compassion in positions of authority. Daniel's dedication to her safety and guidance emphasized the value of commitment, skill, and humanity in the face of danger. Together, they demonstrated that meaningful collaboration could bridge divides, heal wounds, and create opportunities for lasting impact. People watching their actions began to understand that true leadership and heroism were not about power or recognition, but about selfless action and the ability to inspire trust through deeds. In private moments, they would often reflect on how far they had come. The Queen would sometimes smile, recalling the exhaustion and fear of the 30-mile trek through hostile terrain, while Daniel would quietly marvel at how an act of necessity had transformed into a lifelong bond. They understood that their connection was extraordinary because it had been forged in circumstances that tested every part of their courage, endurance, and humanity. That shared experience created a foundation that neither time nor circumstance could erode. Over time, the Queen's advisors and Daniel's colleagues began to understand that their relationship was not just about gratitude or obligation. It was a partnership built on respect, trust, and shared purpose. Their influence extended beyond the immediate tasks at hand, shaping attitudes, inspiring programs, and encouraging acts of courage and compassion in others. Together, they became a living example of what could be achieved when humans prioritized life, morality, and trust above fear, politics, or enmity. Through it all, Daniel remained humble. He never sought recognition or accolades beyond what was necessary to advance their shared goals. The Queen, too, recognized that their connection was rare and valuable, and she nurtured it carefully, ensuring that their bond continued to serve a higher purpose. They understood that their lives were intertwined, not by chance but by a sequence of choices and actions that demonstrated the enduring power of humanity. Even years later, the Queen continued to follow Daniel, attending events he organized, consulting him on critical matters, and maintaining a personal connection that remained extraordinary in its depth and sincerity. Daniel, in turn, respected her wisdom, relied on her guidance, and remained committed to the principles that had brought them together. Their story became a testament to the strength of human connection, the importance of moral courage, and the enduring impact that one act of bravery could have on the lives of many. The bond between them had grown into a lifelong alliance, one rooted in shared trials, mutual respect, and the knowledge that survival and trust can transcend boundaries. They had begun as soldier and queen, enemies by circumstance, but had become partners, collaborators, and witnesses to the extraordinary possibilities of human courage and compassion. Their lives, intertwined by choice and necessity, continued to inspire those around them, demonstrating that loyalty, humanity, and selfless action could create a legacy far greater than either could have imagined.